Welcome to Therapist Confidential, a psychotherapy.net podcast. And now, here's your host, Travis Heath.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Therapist Confidential podcast. I'm your host, Travis Heath, and today I am joined by Anastasia Piatakhina Gire from Paris, France. So Therapist Confidential is going international, which is really cool. And today we will discuss therapy across borders, culture, language, even therapeutic medium. It should be a really invigorating conversation. Anastasia, great to have you here. Great to see you again. Would you mind taking a moment and introducing yourself to our audience?
Thank you, Travis. Thank you for having me here. So I'm a therapist based in Paris, born in Russia, in St. Petersburg, and I lived in a few countries and have been for the last, I would say, over a decade. I have been working with mostly expatriate population, immigrants, second, third generation sometimes. So basically people who, for in different circumstances, for different reasons, left home at some point.
Yeah, your work is fascinating to me for so many different reasons. When we talked on Zoom a couple of weeks ago, we were getting our time zones straight, because like right now it's 9 a.m. my time, it's 6 p.m. your time. So when we talked a few weeks back, you were like, oh, I should have known your time. I just got done seeing a client, in the West Coast of the United States or something. And I thought, wow, like this is the work that you do. I mean, and I'm really interested in learning more about, in the United States, they call it like telehealth, teletherapy, which seems like a ridiculously dated term, but I'm really interested in learning about that sort of work you do and the medium you do it in. And it's really, a type of work that couldn't even have been done like a decade ago. And now here you are based in Paris, and yet you're seeing people all over the world, across language, across culture. I mean, that's absolutely fascinating to me. Could you talk a little bit more about your practice and what it looks like?
Yeah, so I started working basically at the time it was Skype, the old Skype that doesn't exist anymore even. And I started online because I moved countries again, basically, and I found myself having to build my clinical hours as part of my training. And I lived at the time, so I moved from Jersey, small island between France and England, to Madrid, Spain, and my Spanish simply wasn't good enough. I didn't feel like practicing in Spanish, so I had to kind of, go a little global. And quite quickly, from the first few clients, I realized that people that were coming to me were all kind of had a similar profile. They had something in common. That thing was they didn't live in their home country, whether they were French, whatever they were, American, British, they lived elsewhere. And I kind of thought, how that's interesting. Is it because of the medium? Is it because of me? Why? And probably there was a mixture of me and the medium, because I was displaced. That's the term I prefer using actually myself, an immigrant and an expat at that point. And I worked in a few languages at the same time. And I was working online. So these three things, I guess, naturally, organically attracted people just like myself to my practice. That's how it all started.
Yeah, boy, there's a lot in what you just said that I want to lean into. You talked about language there and the term displaced. I'm wondering if you can talk some more about that word and why that language is preferential for you.
So because then at some point I became more and more interested in the topic and tried to kind of understand how I could best help these individuals with their struggles. So I started researching the topic and realized that, at the time there was quite scarce literature in some way about, working with immigrants and also working online. At the time it was pretty new, as you say, and I couldn't find anything really. So I basically ended up writing that book that I, needed so much at the time. And so I had to find a term that kind of sat well with me, that made sense and was kind of inclusive, right? Because expat is very particular, right? It's a very niche, it's a very particular population. Immigrant, those are good, but they, again, have their limitations. So I kind of decided to use this broader term which is more about a more kind of existential experience of displacement. And this is about people, basically whoever who had to leave their original place. And sometimes it can be from one state to another, if they're American, for example, right? It can be from one country to another, one culture to another, from one language to another. So there is some geography usually there. But we also can talk about social displacement, right? People who move from one society to another. So, yeah, I quite like that term, to be honest. So that's I have been using since.
I love something you just said and want to lean into this too. You said you wrote the book you needed,
Yeah,
which I think that's so interesting. I've found myself doing that sometimes too, or writing things to try and explain it to myself. And somehow, if I know another person might actually read it, it holds me accountable in a certain way. But I'm wondering if you can talk some about the book that you needed and ended up writing.
So yes, at the time I was just starting my practice. I had trained as an integrative therapist in the UK. So I had some tools, but they were very limited. And in my training, I had no model, nothing about working in a kind of cross-cultural environment, about working with immigrants, or about working in a second language. And it very quickly became my case, right? I realized that it was easier to develop my practice working in English rather than in for example, Italian or French or Russian. So it very quickly became multilingual. And, I had a sense that it was all impacting my practice or the way I worked. But I couldn't find, of course, some literature did exist, but nothing that could kind of help me to navigate this particular medium and this particular population. And I had a sense already at the time that there was some form of affinity, that this medium was attracting naturally people who were displaced, who were on the move. And that's what my book is about, really. It's how to better work with this population using this particular medium.
Now, you've already talked in the stories you're sharing a little bit about language. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you speak 4 different languages.
I speak 5, but I actively work in 4.
You speak 5, but actively work in 4. Wow. I'm wondering if you can tell us about how, like, I think people who hear your story wonder about, like, okay, because a lot, especially in the United States, there are a lot of monolingual speakers. They've been trained in English, they only practice in English. And then there's this idea that what we do is like we translate therapy like across a language and translating in like a very rote way. You know what I mean? Oh, you say the words in French, and then I translate them literally into what they mean in English, and we're done. But I get the sense that working across language is much more complicated and refined than that because, culture influences language, language influences culture. And here you are working in 4 different languages. I'm wondering if you can talk about that process and how it goes beyond just the literal translation of words.
Look, there is really very little translation involved, probably none. And I'm probably a slightly different therapist in Italian, French, or English, or Russian, my first language. And not only that, but I also work with people, my clients often speak a few languages. Some of our languages cross, some don't. So, I can work in English with a Chinese client who also speaks French. So we would have 2, for example, that's typical, right? We would have 2 shared languages, all of them, both of them, our second languages, and have our native first language for them, Chinese, for me, for example, Russian or something else, that we kind of cannot really actively use. So that, of course, that will impact the process in so many different ways. And I usually start with a lot of curiosity, right? I try to kind of, when a client like this comes in, and the vast majority of my clients have this, a few languages under their belt, I usually start with exploring a little bit their choice. Why did they choose that particular language for their therapy because they have a choice, right? And naturally, we kind of start talking about the relationship with their languages, right? What each language means, how did they learn it, at what point of their time of their lives. All that is usually really precious material that has something directly to do with their history of displacement, right? Whether they were they moved as children because their parents emigrated, or they moved because, studying abroad or something else. So the language usually, is a wonderful window we can use to look into, one person's story. And it's also something that constantly is playing out, right? We use it, we talk, it's talking therapy basically. And the fact that I'm often using my second language or third or whatever, of course impacts the way I work and the process. And in so many ways. For example, maybe the most typical is, when I talk with a client who's, for example, Indian and an immigrant in the States, for example, in the UK or somewhere else, and I'm Russian and I'm an immigrant here in France, and we'll meet somewhere in between. So we'll use our second language, for example, even if for many Indians is the first, but some people it's the second. Well, so we'll be using our second language, which usually is we have a relationship with, we have a history with, and it in some ways it creates a certain distance from our original first culture, probably. That in some situations is it's what desired or unconsciously sought by patients, right? Because there is probably a lot of trauma there that is encoded in that first language. So that's an example. So that's one. And another side kind of effect or a gift that comes out of this situation is that we meet in this slightly neutral territory where we are both foreigners, right? There is this kinship that naturally develops where, they can be very fluent. I can be rather fluent, but at the same time, we are foreign, right? It's not our first language. We had to work hard to learn it. We did it probably consciously, and etc. So that usually is kind of part of what's happening in the therapy room.
You said that you are maybe a slightly different therapist in different languages. Can you say more about that? How conscious of you are you of what sort of therapist you are in what language?
It's not like I'm constantly conscious. Obviously, I'm not thinking about this all the time. But in any session, let's say I'm with a Russian client, a lot of stuff will be coming out for me because, it can be linked to the material that the client is bringing that just kind of brings me back home, let's say. That is some culturally colored, stories, or it can be simply language. I will, for example, very often, of course, there is such thing as an attrition of the first language for immigrants who, have been living for a long time abroad. And it's definitely my case. My Russian isn't as good as it used to be. I don't write in Russian anymore. Haven't been for a long time. I don't think in Russian very much, to be totally honest, but I work in Russian. So when I'm with a Russian client, that all kind of comes back to me. I kind of have to retake ownership of my language, but also a lot of, sense of probably loss and sadness, and also shame probably comes in often for me because I feel the loss of that fluency that I used to have. And, sometimes I can stumble on a word I cannot find, but my clients do the same. But usually they also speak English because my Russian clients often live abroad, or they stumble on a French word. They come up with with the word in a different language because it just sits better with them. It expresses better what they want to say, or they quote a person, for example, in a language that they associate with that person. So I try to so in Russian I may be a little maybe a little more cautious about what I say, and I have to think maybe a little more. Whilst in French or English or even Italian, sometimes it can be more spontaneous, which is counterintuitive in a way, right?
Yeah, I love how you're talking about speaking in languages and also thinking in languages. I do want to dive into here in a little bit the trauma that can be a part of displacement, which I know is some work that you've done. Also, in thinking about language, and leave it to the therapist to use immediacy here, I guess, but the two therapists can't have a conversation without doing this kind of stuff. But here we are having a conversation right now. I'm speaking from United States in my mother tongue. You're speaking not your mother tongue, right? Your mother tongue's Russian. And here we are having a conversation, and someone could say, oh, well, it's just language. But gosh, if you start thinking about sort of the socio-cultural and socio-political that exists and the power that exists in language, and here I am as a monolingual English speaker in the United States, and you're speaking the language that I speak because I can't speak any of the other languages that you speak. And you think about United States kind of global history and even what's happening right now. And gosh, there's a lot that goes into like two people having a conversation right now in English. And I don't know if that's making sense, but I'm wondering if you can talk some of
It's making a lot of sense
Okay, great,
because
great.
yeah, the power dynamics and all kind of subtler, dynamics are always at play as soon as we open our mouths, really, right? Because again, yeah, I mean, not constantly, but I'm pretty aware because I'm used to this of this gap between right your fluency and my fluency. This is your first language, and I actually prefer to use the term first language instead of saying mother tongue, right? Because mother tongue is it's a very particular thing. Right. First of all, people can have two mother tongues in a way, or three, but also, in Lacanian terms, for example, it's a totally different thing. It's that kind of original language that the mother uses, which is more for like sounds, and it's a different thing, right? So first language is a little more neutral in a way. For example, it can be our father's language originally, right? And that's we kind of used as the first. And again, that's also always for people who are biracial, bicultural. It's always interesting to think which language became of which parent became the first, was picked up or used in families first, right? Already there is some power dynamic. There is some relational tension potentially there. So that's something interesting. And for us too, yeah, I'm of course I'm very aware of how I speak, my accent, and it always, especially when I speak with somebody who's not, for whom the English isn't the first language either, it's very different. The sense of kind of embarrassment or shame that naturally comes with having an accent isn't there, right? Because with an Indian, with an Italian, I speak Italian, but Chinese, if we use English second language, we both have accents. They're different, right? But actually, this is kind of normalized. This is equal. We are on equal ground. Whilst with you, obviously, we're not. You'll always be more fluent. And yeah, this impact, when this happens in a therapy room, of course it has an impact, right? And for clients, I think it never happened to me, working as a monolingual therapist with a multilingual client, but I imagine that there is some really interesting literature about that as well, but like what happens if you don't have access, if you don't let the language that you don't speak into the room, what happens then to the client? Can they be seen fully? Right? How do they feel about some of these languages not being part of this process? And of course, we cannot speak all the languages that our clients speak, right? It's impossible. I don't speak Arabic, I don't speak Chinese, I don't speak Japanese, etc., etc. And nevertheless, I work with these people. So it's not about speaking all those languages. It's about I think, developing a kind of more open, curious stance and welcoming, being able to welcome languages we don't even speak into the room somehow, right? And letting the client know that we are curious, we're interested. So what I would typically do is, for example, a client who's, let's say, who speaks Arabic as the first language, and they start quoting a family member who clearly speaks Arabic, right? And I can see that they start translating the quote, the words of this, parent, for example, in their heads, and I I tell them, you can just say it in Arabic, that's okay. I will not understand, but I will hear the music. And then when I feel that, the terms of the words that they are using somehow very important to what's going on, right? To the relational conflict, to trauma or whatever that, is associated with that member of the family, for example, that piece of history. So, I'll sometimes, and it's not about translation, right? It's about, tell me more about this word that, your mother used. For example, right? The father always called me this in Arabic in the text. I'll be, so what does that word mean to you, right? What do you associate it with? So that's the kind of inquiry that I think is important to work with people who speak few languages, really.
The last time you and I were speaking, you gave like an example of an interesting dynamic where you were in conversation with a client. I don't know if they were displaced from Ukraine or living in Ukraine, right? But they were Ukrainian. And of course, you being from Russia and speaking Russian. And of course, given the current war that's going on, all of the sort of sociopolitical and sociocultural context, I'm wondering if you can talk some about that sort of interaction, because I feel like in therapy, sometimes we're not very good about talking about those kinds of things. Like we're good at we're taught to be good at analyzing sort of individual people or their own psychology. It's a very individualist sort of endeavor, and sometimes we miss these larger systemic things. And it's amazing to me how sometimes as therapists, we don't even discuss it. And sometimes maybe it's because we're afraid, or other times we're not even conscious, or our formalized training hasn't taught us to be mindful of this. There could be a lot of different reasons. But I'm wondering if you could talk some about that interaction with a Ukrainian client.
Yeah, so I think that's I didn't remember that example, but it's a good example indeed, because so at the beginning of the war, of course, I was living in Paris and wanted to, I hope to see some Ukrainian clients as well, because of course there was a huge need, right? A lot of trauma happening in kind of life, and so but I also was working with Russians who left at the beginning of the war, left Russia because they couldn't just live there anymore, right? They just couldn't bear it. So many young people were leaving. So I found myself working simultaneously with the Russians who left Russia because of the war, and Ukrainians who had to flee Ukraine because of the war. And that was, a very interesting time, and of course very difficult. And so at the time I brought even a whole piece titled Russian Shame, because shame was, of course, so much part of the process. So, sitting in a therapy room, virtual or not, with an Ukrainian client who was, fleeing the war, actually, a lot of that was happening online. So, people were literally, the cities were under assault. It was, very, very difficult situation for them. And maybe in Russian, even if I had left Russia almost 30 years ago at this point, obviously I still associate myself with this culture. I grew up there, I have friends there, my parents live there, so I have some attachment to this place still. A lot of shame was coming up. It was difficult to be proud, and even now it's difficult to be proud to be Russian, right? It's not the best time to be Russian. And again, power dynamics, yeah. I mean, I was a therapist. I kind of, had this role. I was helping them. That was my job in a way. But at the same time, I was sitting there feeling horrible, like really amount of shame about what, the state I'm associated with is doing. So that was, and we were literally sitting and for hours, like with Russian clients, processing that shame, because they were feeling the same thing, of course, having left Russia, living somewhere else, and being perceived as Russian. So, Russians sometimes, there are many people who are half Russian, half Ukrainian, for example. This is very typical. There are a lot of mixed families. And those people who, had kind of roots on both sides the border, they would say, oh, I'm Ukrainian. They would be very ashamed to be Russian, for example. So that's something would, the way I kind of navigated this, I was honest, I would say that at some point, if appropriate, for the client, something that we could discuss openly. And I think it was important to be honest about that and address it at some, point. And I only believe in relational therapy, just back to your, comment. I don't believe in individualistic kind of any, therapy, right? Approach to therapy. I don't think it exists. I mean, therapy only exists in a relationship. It's a relational process. Otherwise, we would be replaced by AI in 30 seconds, literally tomorrow, right? But I don't think we will because again, the relational component, we build relationships. We actively work at building relationships. And that's exactly what we're doing right now, you and me, right? We're kind of building a sort of relationship between us. And as we do that, some interesting stuff happens, right? We come up with some ideas, some insight, understanding. We share something. This is the process, really. So that can be only relational. So yeah.
Yes, I think now might be an interesting time to talk some about the potential trauma of displacement. And this is something, you have lived experience of, and also you work with people, that have been displaced every day. And it's interesting because I think I've heard of a few people here or there who I've never heard the word displacement actually in the context you're using it. That was new to me and meeting you. But I've heard people talk about, like the challenges and difficulties of moving someplace else. But that's a little different than like the potential trauma of displacement that you talk very directly about. I'm wondering if you can today talk a little bit more about that trauma of displacement, the cost, the sort of psychological, emotional cost of uprooting.
Look, this is a very good question, a very broad topic. So, there is this older from the 80s, actually, definition of definition of displacement or exile or again expatriation, all those things, which is trauma and crisis. And I remember reading that when I first just started, kind of thinking about this topic. That really rang true. Like it made sense, right? Because I had this firsthand experience of being uprooted and having moved, away from my country when I was 19 barely, that I knew what it just felt right? Trauma and crisis. So why crisis and trauma? So basically, no, and that's why it's so difficult to kind of grasp it. Even in the best, let's say, best case scenario, okay, somebody who is voluntarily leaves their place, they leave for a better life. People usually leave for a better, they hope, right? They hope to have a better life when they are able to make the decision, of course. I'm talking about voluntary displacement, okay? So people make the decision, they go somewhere else, hoping to have a better life somewhat, somehow. Get education, get better job, follow a partner and hope for a better life, marital life, whatever that is. So they do that. And even in the best case scenario, which is basically an expat, right? Some of my clients are in this case scenario, not many, but some are. So let's say somebody who's, well educated, very well paid, moves to a different country, different culture for a job. They are helped with the move, right? Some people pack their stuff. Somebody helps them to find their apartment. They have schooling paid for. This is the best case scenario, right? Their spouse comes with them, hoping to somehow, make a life there in this new place. And then something happens. And that something happens is the crisis, right? People, and I see these clients quite a lot, actually, coming into my office. They can be lawyers, they can be, working for the military, whatever. So quite stable situations, stable job, good salary, they live in beautiful apartments, usually paid for, great life, right? Looks all on the paper, looks amazing, like everybody's jealous, basically, right? Everybody's telling them, wow, you're so lucky. That's the best case scenario, the best one. But what happens? They come to see me in a sort of crisis. Something suddenly starts, usually in the first few months, first year, let's say. Suddenly they start feeling a lot, like they start feeling bad. Usually, right, it's not always very defined. It can be some level of anxieties, it can be some depressive feelings, it can be some sort of confusion, grief. There is a lot that is usually happening. And it's so people come into therapy at that stage of their displacement journey, often not very well, especially if it's their first time, right? They don't exactly know why they're feeling this way, what's going on. They can actually come because of relational crisis. Their spouse isn't very happy in the new place, for example. Their kids kind of, struggling in school. Or they, for example, one very typical example is struggle to learn the local language. They really want to, right? They feel very committed. They try hard, but they stumble on this blockage. They just cannot learn it. And it creates a lot of frustration. So, so they come in and we kind of start talking about their experience and what has been, what made them leave, we explore their history, whether it's the first time they left, or maybe in childhood they had already left, but they don't remember well because they were very young. So we kind of dig into this history. And usually what happens is that we start understanding a little better the level of the crisis they're dealing with. And that's where we start thinking about the loss involved in the process, right? The loss of the familiar place, of friends, right? Of all the social bonds that they had in the original place, family, schoolmates, right? All of that suddenly disappears. That's one thing. And the second, as a result of that, they're faced with the unfamiliar. So a language they don't understand yet. So language barrier obviously is a huge thing. The social codes they don't understand. Lack of friends. I mean, it's very difficult, right, as an adult in a foreign place to develop friendships or any kind of deeper relationship. So all that kicks in, and that's traumatic. That's very traumatic. Why is it traumatic? Because the whole kind of story the person was telling to themselves about, themselves, their identity, basically it's an identity confusion that happens, right? Where our identity is threatened by this rupture and this unfamiliar place. And then when the best work can be done, this is the best time to start therapy, I think. Generally speaking, this is a great time because then we can use this window of crisis and identity crisis, because that's how I see it as well, to dig into kind of some deeper processes, and everything that probably had been sitting there unresolved or unaddressed because people didn't need to, they didn't, probably didn't experience that level of crisis before, suddenly becomes available. It all comes up, right? The early feelings of grief and loss, the early feelings of shame, because that's obviously a big part of this process. All that suddenly becomes very kind of, comes to the surface. So I usually use that window to do some deeper work.
Gosh, there's so much in what you've just said. One thing that you noted is that it can be almost a crisis of identity, that a person's identity is threatened. And like right now in the United States, and this has gone on for some time, but just right now, I live about 5 miles from the border with Mexico in San Diego. It's interesting because there's so much talk about assimilation, and people need to assimilate. And of course, that's the language that they speak and so much more. And then, but language and culture can be very dear to people, and people want to hold on to that. And then there's the questions of like, well, how do they hold on to that in a society that may be telling them not to hold on to that? And it can be very difficult. And I can see how that would be a deep existential threat to one's sense of identity and how they're storing that identity. I'm wondering how you work, and I'm sure it varies with each person, I get it, but just in a general sense, how you work with this kind of tension of assimilation versus tension of, maintaining what's dear to a person that they wish to keep wherever they might travel or be.
Oh gosh, Yeah, I have a very, it's so funny, like as I was listening to you, I'm having this very strong emotional response to what you're saying, which is
Oh, yes.
so, so that means something. I really dislike the term assimilation. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's a very colonial term. It's the
Yes.
old anthropology term. We don't use it anymore. I mean, when I say we, I don't use it. It's
Yes.
something that is obsolete. Because it's obviously when you say assimilation, it means that one culture has to give place to another, right? Like, and
Yes.
there is, and it's true that some cultures have more prestige, let's say, more power. It's about power, right? And some cultures, for some reason, at some points of their history, have less. Right. So, for example, right now, yes, it's better to be white American rather than a Mexican immigrant. It's pretty obvious, like there are obvious reasons for that, right? It's about power, it's about all kind of power. So it's a huge power dynamic, and so that's one thing. So I think it's not helpful to see this tension between, between the kind of let's say people who as locals, which again not a great term, but we have to kind of somehow define it. Okay, people have been living in this place for a long time and speak this language and kind of are familiar with this culture, and those who are not yet and who are coming in from somewhere else and carrying their own culture, their own language, their own codes, beliefs, etc., etc. There is obviously always tension. As humans, we are, naturally not very disposed to embrace the foreign. We naturally are threatened by the foreign. We dislike the foreign, and it takes us a lot of work on both sides, I guess, for those who, kind of receiving the end and, those who arrive. We all have to make an effort. And it's a huge emotional effort as well, right? It takes some emotional labor, it takes some humanity, it takes a lot of things. Be humble and be open and be curious. And that is, not always a natural kind of tendency for humans. And also, when you say the language and the culture that is dear to them, I think it's an understatement. Um, you know, Actually, people can have, when I see it with my clients all the time, and actually I include myself, that we can have some very tense and very ambivalent relationships with our home culture. I mean, our regional culture. I cannot say that my relationship with my Russian culture is without tensions or ambivalence. It's right, and probably the same goes for you, and for many of us. It's not always all smooth and nice. It's
Mm.
and at the same time we have a huge attachment to our culture and our language and our original place, and that attachment, again, I quite I think it's helpful to use the term attachment, because we usually, when we talk about attachment, we think about relational attachment, right? Attachment to our early figures, blah, blah. But, we're attached to all kinds of things. We're attached to a place, we're attached to a language. So there's a lot of attachment kind of history that links us, right? That is related or associated with those early bonds to a place or language. And when we move, we can distance ourselves and kind of on the surface, it looks like we can resolve that, right? And we can embrace this new culture, new place that we often idealize at the beginning, especially if we decided to move in this new place. But then it's more subtle than this, and it's much more nuanced and more complicated, unfortunately, than this, because all the tensions that we, carry with us about those early attachments, they all will be triggered as we will be building new bonds, right? That's the same as for, any psychodynamic therapy kind of looks into this usually, right? So, yeah.
Gosh, I love so much of what you said, and how the process of displacement, and how one, it's funny to say this, how one should properly displace is framed through colonial logic and colonial language. And I think, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, what you were starting to offer up there and articulate is maybe how to navigate this through a more anti-colonial lens. And I'm wondering how you explicitly do that in the work you're doing. You resist colonial logic. I mean, one way is resisting colonial language, like assimilation, for example. But I'm imagining, just listening to you, there are other ways that you might reject colonial logic and interpretation of displacement and how one should properly displace.
I love your question. Look, I don't know. I don't think, and I certainly don't know how to, displace in the right way.
Hmm.
It's always a very messy process, right? The nature of this process is messy. We get dirty, right? Emotionally, I mean, emotionally speaking, and it's very important to get dirty, right? To feel all these things and work through it. And I think, if I kind of have to in a way describe this process in some terms, I think we kind of move from initial shame that is triggered by, being exposed to the unfamiliar, losing our language, feeling like we don't speak. So there's a lot of kind of regression there. So there's a lot of shame that is associated naturally with, with the early stages of displacement. It never goes away totally, right? For example, right, we never will never be just, right, perfect in a language that we learn later in life. I will always keep my accent, always, right? So that shame never goes away totally, but we work through it, right? We learn how to sit with it, to acknowledge it, to recognize it, right? And to also kind of dare to do better, right? To get ambitious, to learn the language, and so on. And through this process, we probably move from shame to pride on that continuum, right? We start feeling proud of ourselves because we can get that job that requires a certain level of French, right? Or we can give that lecture in Italian or whatever, right? And that's a very important process. And in the therapy room, so you asked how, like there's this fancy term, decolonize the therapy room or whatever. Yeah, I don't think this is like easily done, but what I think drives me or helps me to kind of keep that in mind when I work with, clients where I know that there is probably some of that dynamic happening with that for them even, right? Whether it can be not related to me because I come from a kind of a particular place that is very removed from some of the places my clients come from, right? For example, I don't know, I can work with somebody who's, Uyghur, for example, right? Or Mongolian, or Chinese from a certain region again, or something else. And I kind of know, or somebody who's, for example, Irish, as simple as that, actually, that's close, nearby, but there's a huge, right, history of colonization and like very tense and difficult history there. So I keep that in mind if I'm aware of that. I'm not always, I don't know, the history of all of the countries. So sometimes I'm not, but when I am, I try to keep that in mind. And I think how can I navigate that to not replay some of those dynamics? I think curiosity and humility always help. I mean, right, I'm always curious about my clients' experience, which seems natural and obvious thing to say for a therapist, right? But again, I include the kind of cultural history. I include all kind of cultural codes, the language, again, even if I don't speak it. And especially clients' feelings that arise when they bump into a different culture, right? When they travel, when they expatriate, like what happens for them? How does it, what does it touch in them? What kind of feelings? Again, usually shame is always there. Like shame is such, of course it's a, huge human emotion. It's always part of any almost therapy. It's a relational, social emotions. It always comes up natural, right? At some point, nobody's immune to that. But I think it's a particularly important emotion to kind of see and recognize and work with clients who experience displacement.
You're just talking about emotions there, and one of the things you've referenced in some of your writing, and it's like emotional migration, and I'm wondering about the difference between emotional migration and physical migration and how that impacts people. And obviously there's probably some overlap too. but I just found that a really fascinating idea, this idea of emotional migration.
Look, again, if we start kind of seeing migration or displacement in kind of existential terms, then I think it becomes pretty obvious that, a person can feel terribly displaced without moving anywhere, really, physically, right? For example, I mean, probably an obvious example is people who feel trapped in their original place, for example, for some reason. For example, typically right now there are quite, many Russians that don't feel safe, don't feel comfortable with living in Russia, but they cannot leave, right? They have, old parents, they have young children, they don't have money, they don't speak, a different language well enough. I mean, whatever those reasons are, but they kind of, how do they cope with this, right? If they don't feel, because of the political mismatch, right? The values mismatch, all those kind of things. How do they cope? What happens to them? And one of the coping mechanisms, one of the ways we do it, we leave without leaving, right? We kind of go inwards, we withdraw. So it can look like depression, for example, right? People isolate themselves or go into this internal kind of, words that they develop. And it's very hard to see from the outside. It's painful because they do feel totally kind of mismatched to the place where they live. And again, it's not just the political context that can create that kind of internal migration or displacement. It can be, for example, I can work with somebody who's, gay or trans and living in a, place where the culture, local culture doesn't accept that. And they cannot just go there and be, who they need to be and present themselves in the way that is comfortable for them. So again, how do people cope? Of course, there are different ways, and shame is always part of the process, right? It's terrible to be rejected the way you are, the way you really generally feel by the place, especially when it's your original place, right? It's like be rejected by parents. And some of these people are rejected by parents and the place and the kind of local community. And I think that's a form of displacement. That's a form of kind of migration inwards, because it kind of looks the kind of, if you want to use more clinical terms, like the clinical picture can be very similar to what we see in some migrants or expatriates.
What have you learned about loneliness in this sort of global, very connected, quote unquote, connected context, yet so mobile? And like, this is, in some ways, it's a miracle you and I are able to have this conversation right now across the world from one another, and we can record it and we can disseminate it. Like, it's amazing. But it seems to me that, loneliness is manifesting in really interesting ways in people's lives, these sort of transient mobile lives that we live. And I'm wondering what the work you do has taught you about loneliness in this global kind of mobile context we live in.
Oh yeah, look, of course, we do know, right? Statistics show it very clearly that the kind of loneliness is on the rise, and as a result of that, depression and anxiety, all kind of problems, mental health problems arise from that. But at the same time, I also think that kind of loneliness is part of the kind of, again, it's an existential theme in humans' lives. It's kind of probably made worse by this globalization, mobility, digital communication, tools, all that stuff. Because it can look like, I think before all these technologies, one was just lonely. It was obvious, right? They were alone, right? People could find themselves isolated, physically, very clearly alone and lonely as a result. And that makes sense, right? You can make sense of that. And therefore you can work with this, you can kind of cope, you can think, you can conceptualize that, right? You can have a kind of verbalize that. What happens with people now who are so connected, as you say, right? Like many of my clients, especially the highly mobile people, like digital nomads, actually people, ironically, people who work in tech and who work on developing AI and all that stuff, they have this incredible from the outside lives. They're so connected, quote unquote, right? They have friends all over the world, which is actually my case as well, right? And at the same time, they feel often terribly isolated and lonely. And it's very confusing because, again, it looks so nice. But I chat with 20 friends daily, right, on WhatsApp. How come that I feel this horrible feeling of loneliness? That makes no sense. Right? That's confusing, right? And that's what we work with, right? We kind of have to reflect on this. Why, how things look from the outside are different from the way we really feel. And social media does that. We know that, right? People have very different lives out there. They have personas and they have, stories that they tell about themselves. But actually, when we see them in therapy, we know, that actually the real stories, the kind of felt story is often very, very different. And that gap is always problematic, right? It's difficult to have that gap, and bigger the gap, more problematic it is. More we have to address it and right think about what's lacking, and what usually is lacking. It's a stronger sense of community, right? The kind of real life, real embodied friends, right? Who are around, that we can touch, talk with, and go out for a coffee. But again, that's not always, available when we move countries, or not readily available. We have to work extra hard to get that, to build that again.
Given the work that you do, I'm wondering what you've come to learn about the term home. What does this term mean to people geographically, relationally, internally? What have you learned about home?
Look, nothing. I mean, everything and nothing, because with every person, every new client I sit with, client who has, some history of displacement, right, especially highly mobile. I mean, I work, for example, with people who, circus actors, right, who move literally for 20 years, live out of a suitcase for 20 years, or kind of researchers that, again, people in academia, some people in academia, again, have to move a lot. I mean, right, there are different jobs that make people move in this way for a long, long time. And when we see it, and we kind of, at some point, the topic of home comes up very, very quickly, right? Do they have a home? Do they feel about any place like home? Do they have multiple homes? All that obviously is, something we talk about, and there is never an easy, straightforward answer. I mean, it's very rare that people tell me, oh, that place feels like home. Very rarely, right? Usually it's, oh, that feels somewhat like home, but, and then we develop, and then it gets more complicated. So, that kind of sense, and what is home? I mean, there is one, the only definition that probably is maybe somehow makes sense to me is the home where we feel safe. That feeling safe, and often it's, for people who have some history of displacement and high mobility, it's not always associated with a place. It can be associated with a person or people or a pet or that dumb suitcase where they have a few objects that they, love and that make sense to them and have a history. I mean, it can be so many different things. And usually, again, when we move again and again, it's not just one home, it's a multiple kind of attachment that we develop. And it's very complex, attachment. So yeah, I don't think there is a straightforward answer to that question.
If you look at the way that therapy is typically done these days, and, typically is an interesting word, but in general, the way therapy is typically done versus maybe some things you've discovered in your work, which I would describe as not the typical way that most people are doing therapy. I don't think most people are doing therapy in 4 languages across the globe. So what sort of observations or advice might you give the establishment of therapy based on what you've been able to learn from the unique contexts that you're practicing therapy in?
Look, and that's what I wrote the book that I wrote, actually a couple of books that I wrote about the topic, is that, these clients, especially if you work online, no matter, which language you speak, whether it's just one or more, where you live, if at some point you work online, you open your door, your virtual therapist, room door to people like my clients, right? People who, or you will always at some point will have a client walking into your room who carries, a different culture and a different, probably very complex history of, displacement and a few languages that you don't speak. And, it's what matters, I think, what really, what does it mean to be good therapists with these clients? For me, it's all about, again, curiosity, being open to, feelings that arise in you, probably feeling of, it will be, we can feel some form of shame because we are met with the unfamiliar, right? The client from, I don't know, a country you've never been to that speaks a language you absolutely don't have an idea of, very unfamiliar, comes into your room. Of course, it triggers a lot of, feelings. And I think shame is one of those, right? Not just being exposed to the unfamiliar, not feeling in control, not knowing what to do, right? They tell you stories that you cannot relate to, for example, right? So how not to feel a little lost, right? A little displaced, a little ashamed, all those things. And those feelings will probably mirror. They will be very similar to what that person is experiencing in their displacement. So again, that's kind of working with countertransference, if you wish. I can use those words, right? It's kind of using that information, those feelings to inquire into your client's experience. Be curious again, and I think curiosity is the best tool we have.
I want to ask you about that. I'm curious about your curiosity. Why do you think that that's the best tool that we have?
Because, if you're curious about someone, and their story, suddenly you're driven by this feeling instead of being driven by, any kind of defenses that may rise, fears, shame, and stuff like that. I think it opens things up. It's an invitation, right? That if we feel that the person in front of us is curious, we feel an openness, right? It's an invitation to, to share the story. And I think every therapist is a naturally curious person. I mean, any good enough therapist, right? We are very curious people. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing this job, right? We are constantly, curious about other people's stories, and I think, working with this particular population, working cross-culturally, this is the best tool. It's an affordable tool, right? It's very, it's there. It's not out of reach. It's just, it's within us. And that's what I would use, curiosity and humility.
Curiosity and humility, two qualities that are seemingly more elusive in our modern culture by my observation, and in some ways not valued. Like it seems like less value is being placed on being curious. There's a lot of interpretation and a lot of judgment and a lot of analyzing and making sense of why people are doing things. I see a lot less curiosity. And even in our field, sometimes I don't see a lot of curiosity. And so I was curious about why you feel curiosity to be so important. I share that as well. As we're wrapping up, I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about your books. I mean, there's the book Unlocked, which is a really interesting one. And I hope this doesn't embarrass you, but I want to read something that Irvin Yalom, of course, everybody knows Irvin Yalom, what Irvin Yalom said about the book Unlocked, online therapy stories. Here's what he said about Anastasia's work. This is first-rate storytelling. These tales of therapy entirely drew me in and left me wanting more. So one thing about this book that I think it's important people realize is this isn't just another academic book. I mean, it's captivating stories that draw people in. It's telling people stories more than it is like lecturing at them about concepts, you know? And at least for me, those are the best kind of books to read. I mean, if we've been through graduate school and gotten PhDs, I mean, we've been lectured at for how many years and we've read all sorts of things. But what's often really instructive for me in my own work, I'm biased in this direction, are stories, actual stories where you feel like, oh, you're a fly on the wall in the room and you kind of have a sense of what's going on. So high praise from Irvin Yalom about that. But I'm wondering if you can talk some about Unlocked and any of your other work that, you know, you might invite people into reading after our conversation today.
Look, I don't think you're biased. I think we're all humans are drawn to stories, and the story well told is, is what really helps us to, understand the world better, understand other people better, understand ourselves better, and navigate the realities that can be hard to navigate. I mean, this book is, I wrote it during COVID. It's really was inspired by my clients and the work we were doing during COVID, so in lockdown, hence the title Unlocked. But at the same time, it's really basically it's vignettes, it's cases, it's I'm inviting anyone who's interested in therapy actually or kind of human processes into this very intimate space of a therapy room that is virtual and an encounter, very kind of relational encounter between the therapist and the client who are both trapped right in their spaces in their lives by the circumstances. So it's a kind of crisis that is universal at that point. And at the same time, it's experienced by my immigrant, displaced, highly mobile clients in a very particular way, right? So that's the book, and I had a lot of fun writing it. Really, I love telling stories.
Yeah, it's apparent, and you seem to have a talent for storytelling. If so, there's this book Unlocked, which is great. You can, you know, just search that on Google or AI or however you do your searching these days, and Anastasia's book will show up there. There's also a great interview you did with Larry Rubin, teletherapy, borders and building bridges that people can read. Any websites, or if people wanted to, you know, connect with you in certain ways, would you direct them any particular place?
Yes, I have a website that has been, like has been operating for a long time now, and it's expatriate.com. That's where, clients book sessions. There's some examples of my writing, blogs, and all kind of stuff.
Yeah, Anastasia, it's been a pleasure. Uh, I've really enjoyed the conversation for a whole host of reasons. I think one of the things I've enjoyed most is just this is a topic area that seems woefully underexplored. Like there's so much so many rich ideas here. And yes, for people that are working with expats, I mean, your work would be fundamental. But I think it's not just for people working with expats, and your work, there are implications for how we do work across language and across culture. And this is something we talk about a lot in our field. You know, everyone has to take like a multicultural counseling class, but I'm not sure we always talk about it in ways that students can integrate it into their practice. And sometimes we talk about it sort of on the fringes in ways that feel sort of almost dead and dormant. And but the way you talk about it, it's alive. And the stories you're sharing, I mean, you know, we talk about like multicultural or cross-cultural practice. I mean, that's your practice in action.
It is, and the other book I wrote, which is more kind of academic, is more, for therapists who want to work with this population. I still kind of wrote many, many vignettes, many cases, described real situations, because again, I think that what makes this whole thing alive, right? People's stories. Without them, we wouldn't be talking, right? We wouldn't be therapists. We wouldn't exist really. So I think stories are a huge part of it all.
Mm, that's a lovely line to close on. Anastasia Piatakhina Gire, again, Unlocked, great book. You can check that out. Check out, you know, the blog that the interview Larry Rubin did. It's really great work. And Anastasia, I hope this won't be our last conversation. I appreciate your time in the evening there in Paris. And gosh, I've learned a lot in the last hour. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Travis. I really enjoyed the conversation. I hope to see you again.